I have the great pleasure of introducing to you someone this morning whose name often comes up in my own home. This next speaker is a friend and a colleague of my partner's who has been working in a similar world. When we hear about the advancement of the work of recognizing sex workers, the name of Kerry Porth is often what is spoken in communities that care about the well-being of sex workers, as I say, in my home as well. Kerry Porth is a former sex worker and current sex worker rights activist, a community developer with Living in Community. Kerry has years of experience working with marginalized people, grassroots movements in Vancouver's downtown east side, and has been working to effect social change through strategic litigation, public education, and advocacy. She has worked as a research assistant on projects relating to the sex industry and regularly lectures at colleges and universities. Her expertise relates to sex work activism, training, policy, law, and governance. Please help me welcome Kerry Porth.
Good morning, everyone, and don't worry, I'm going to finish before it's time for lunch, so we don't have a shortened lunch break. Thank you very much for having me today. Thank you to Tracy and Eva BC. Eva has been working for a number of years now to sort of raise the issue of the safety of sex work, and so I'm very appreciative for that. I'd like to start by thanking the Musqueam people on whose stolen territory we gather today for their continuous relationship to and stewardship of this land. I want to talk today about the ways in which women who sell or trade sex have been excluded from the women's movement. I'm not here to point fingers or to shame anyone, but to undo this injustice, we must first understand the injustice itself. Starting in the 1970s, the sex wars around prostitution and pornography continue to rage within feminism today. In recent years, campaigns to abolish the sex industry in its entirety, as well as the emergence of sex work exclusionary and trans exclusionary radical feminism, have continued to divide feminists in ways that can feel exhausting, ugly, and often unsafe. Sex workers feel this divide very keenly, and it often leaves them asking, are we not women? Despite the fact that women who sell or trade sex experience high rates of violence and exploitation, they rarely turn to women's anti-violence organizations to support them because it doesn't feel safe for them to do so. Sex work, by its very nature, is clandestine, and much of what people believe to be true about sex workers is based in myth and stereotype. When seeking services, sex workers often complain that what they say about their own experience is filtered through these stereotypes, and they feel unheard, disempowered, and judged. It should come as no surprise that sex workers feel this way. I'm going to show you a few examples of feminist messages around sex work and sex workers. And I'm going to start with Twitter because social media has proven to be an incredible tool for sex work organizing, but also for reducing the isolation and social marginalization that sex workers experience. There are literally tens of thousands of sex workers on Twitter, and yet they face daily attacks from feminists. So just before I move on to the slides showing these tweets, these are all real tweets. I have a large collection of mean tweets that I've screen captured. I've redacted names and dates and all of that kind of stuff. So the first one, a sex worker had tweeted, "My only requirement is that my clients treat me with respect." And she was immediately faced with this response. "Here's a couple of $100. Now bend over and shut the F up. Doesn't sound like dignity or respect to me. If they respected you as a person, they wouldn't be paying to rent access to your vagina." So far too often, clients who have paid for sexual services believe that they are entitled to do whatever they want. But the funny thing is they don't get that idea from sex workers. Part of that attitude is, of course, the socialization that men receive, But I would argue that a good part of it is the never-ending messaging about women being bought and sold by like objects that is so much a part of the current feminist discourse on prostitution. When feminists complain about the sexual objectification of women, this tweet does a great job of contributing to that, of sex working women by reducing her to a body part. The next tweet is quite disturbing, and it's much more explicit about some feminist desire that sex workers should just go away. It says, "I can't wait until you end up like the rest of those missing and murdered Indigenous women." Well, MMS, I think S refers to sex worker or slut because woman is too generous a term. They blame sex workers for the harms that sex workers experience and for a host of issues that women experience under patriarchy. But sex workers are not responsible for patriarchy. Thankfully, the woman who tweeted this has been banned from Twitter for this and similar attacks. This desire among some feminists to make prostitution go away, as if that will somehow usher in a feminist utopia, has embedded within it a hatred of sex workers. The next image I'll show you is from a European feminist group called Femen, which now has branches in Canada. They use some fairly explicit imagery, so this is a pretty explicit image. I'm just not sure from this image whether it's male clients she wants to whack with that baseball bat or whether it's sex workers. I'm not sure if she's supposed to be a sex worker or Femen often does these protests topless, so I'm guessing she's one of the warriors of Femen. It's a really disgusting image, and this is the kind of thing that sex workers are confronted with on a fairly regular basis. I could have shown you some images from anti-trafficking campaigns. Those are also incredibly degrading. They use incredibly violent imagery, but I chose not to do that today. This next tweet addresses some of the trans exclusionary feminism related to the 2017 Vancouver Women's March, where trans sex worker Haley Hartless was invited to address the crowd. So a bunch of people who faint at the sight of a Confederate flag are going to have a pro-slavery march with a man in woman face being lauded as a role model for young girls. What a gross farce that's going to be. This tweet misgenders a trans woman and uses a racially charged term, woman face. The intent of these messages is to shame trans women and to exclude them from women's spaces. And the reference to pro-slavery is pretty laughable given that Haley is self-employed in BDSM. While your organization's staff or board members might not engage in this type of behavior, the idea that sex work is inherently harmful has led to support from some anti-violence organizations for in-demand criminalization of the sex industry, which continues to cause harm to sex workers both in Canada and other countries around the world. And here we have two Canadian examples. This is the London Abused Women's Centre. They believe that prostitution is men's violence against women. And from a local organization, Vancouver Rape Relief, who have been incredibly active in campaigns to abolish prostitution, including intervening in the case of Bedford v. Canada, testifying to the parliamentary and Senate committees, and in help, supported the Harper government to create the laws that we're stuck with today. You can see, obviously, from their messaging that they clearly identify prostitution as a form of violence against women, irrespective of the circumstances in which it takes place, and regardless of what the sex worker might say about their own experience. In-demand criminalization purports to remove criminal sanctions against sex workers and puts the focus of law enforcement on the men who purchase sexual services or profit from sex workers' labor. Sex workers around the world have been lobbying for the removal of all criminal penalties associated with adult sex work for more than 40 years. This is because when any aspect of sex work is criminalized, including the purchase of sex work must continue to occur within a criminalized environment, and that leaves sex workers more vulnerable to violence and exploitation. So if a sex worker sees a clear message on an organization's website indicating support for criminalization of the industry she happens to work in, her means of making a living, is it any wonder that they wouldn't consider approaching that organization for help? Decriminalization of sex work is the removal of all criminal penalties associated with adult sex work, including the purchase of sexual services. This would not usher in a free-for-all, as municipal health and labor regulations could then be applied to the sex industry, and crimes against sex workers would be addressed by laws that already exist, such as those regarding assault, sexual assault, forcible confinement, etc. You might have heard that decriminalization is something that only more privileged white sex workers from the global north want, but that is simply not true. As an example, the Global Network of Sex Work Projects supports decriminalization and is a membership organization made up of sex work groups in 5 regions: Africa, Asia and the Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and North America and the Caribbean. And they represent tens of thousands of sex workers. Decriminalization is also supported by UN Women, UN AIDS, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, Human Rights Watch, Anti-Slavery International, and Amnesty International, and these are just a few of the larger international organizations that support it. If your organization supports End Demand or any other regime of sex work criminalization, you may wish to undertake your own research to understand how these laws actually increase the risk of harm against sex workers. Other organizations have very deliberately conflated sex work between consenting adults with human trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. These are absolutely not the same things and can be differentiated by the presence of coercion, force, or the abuse of power. If we really want to commit to meeting women where they are at, then they must be able to define their own experiences. Sex workers report feeling frustrated when others label them a trafficking victim when that is not really their experience. When this happens, services are offered that will likely not meet the sex worker's needs. For example, they may be referred to exiting services on the assumption that all sex workers must want to get out, but this is not always the case. It is critical that sex workers are listened to and believed when they describe their own experiences. After all, is this not something that feminists have advocated for many years? If we can agree on that, then why is this not something we extend to women who sell or trade sex? Organizational position statements about abolishing prostitution and demand laws and human trafficking are barriers to sex workers who don't feel that their experiences are reflected. These position statements must be developed with sex workers. To do otherwise is to take a position that opposes the human rights of women who sell or trade sex when they are a group most in need of women's anti-violence services and supports. These are political positions. These are ideological positions. For organizations that claim to support women where they are at, to support them in their self-determined goals, this is unacceptable. Some organizations, however, are doing the hard work to change. Recently, Women Against Violence Against Women formally apologized to sex workers. Yes. And have passed a position statement supporting the decriminalization of sex work. And I can tell you the sex workers on Twitter were going crazy about this. The sort of tweet was retweeted all over the world. It was amazing to watch. They are working hard with sex work organizations to develop services appropriate to the needs of sex workers and to increase accessibility to their services for sex workers. Earlier, they did similar work to become trans-inclusive as well. This organization is to be commended and will hopefully serve as a model for other women's anti-violence organizations who wish to undertake similar processes of change. And this summer, I was happy to stop by the Nelson and District Women's Center on my holidays after they had posted a pro-sex worker message on their Facebook page. Sex work occurs everywhere, so it's important that even small organizations in more rural centers consider making changes as well. Of course, it is very tempting to blame men and support end demand criminalization, as men are usually the perpetrators of violence against sex workers. Others are disgusted by what they see as male sexual entitlement, and maybe it would help to know that lots of sex workers are disgusted by that too. Again, sex workers aren't responsible for patriarchy. Here's the problem: most people focus on the sex in sex work, while sex workers focus on the work part. And I hope maybe this idea might be a way for people who continue to struggle with the meaning of sex work, those who believe it's the worst incarnation of patriarchy that causes the bodies of mostly poor and racialized women to be bought, sold, and used by men, or that there could be no consent to sex if money is involved. Perhaps a labor analysis might help. The reality is that people sell sex to earn money. Sometimes sex workers are asked whether they would have sex with their clients if they weren't being paid, and this assumes that work must somehow be fulfilling, non exploitative, and enjoyable. But if this was actually the case for all workers in all workplaces, we would have no need for unions or labor laws. Sex workers locate the problems they experience, including violence and exploitation, in their work and exclusion from labor protections everyone else takes for granted. Current prostitution laws prevent sex workers from forming unions or being covered under labor laws. They can't even address banal workplace issues such as long shifts or illegal fines without risking their workplace being shut down and their manager being arrested for pimping. Violence against women occurs in other occupations as well. Let's think about nursing. But we never talk about abolishing the profession of nursing. No, the violence that nurses experience is addressed through labor law, the presence of security personnel, and their ability to report to police and have their case taken seriously. Women are especially prone to poverty, and in this light, turning to sex work can perhaps be viewed as a rational decision. Single mothers, women with disabilities, often talk about the flexibility that sex work provides them. And trans women in particular often find that traditional employment is hard for them to get, and so they turn to sex work as an alternative. But you might ask, what about more marginalized sex workers who are working at the intersections of race, poverty, and addiction? Decriminalization will not change the fact that some individuals are forced by circumstances beyond their control to resort to sex work when it's the last thing they want to be doing, but it's certainly a critical first step. What's actually needed is a commitment by all three levels of government to raise women out of poverty and provide them with real options to support themselves so that the only people doing sex work are those who feel a calling to do so. And despite what many people think, there are lots of women who enjoy doing sex work. By responsibilizing shadowy pimps and the men who pay for sexual services as our current laws do, the state is relieved of its obligation to address the systemic material inequities faced by women, especially Indigenous women. The violence and exploitation that sex workers experience is a symptom, not a cause. Poverty is the real source of women's vulnerability. So perhaps by taking the sex out of sex work, we can stop exceptionalizing the violence that sex workers experience. Far more exceptional, at least to my mind, is the rate that women are murdered by their intimate partners in Canada, a rate, I might add, that far exceeds the murder rate of sex workers. There's an epidemic of violence against women in this country, and should it really matter under what circumstances that violence occurs? By focusing on the circumstances of sex work, by seeing it as inherently violent, we participate in a form of victim blaming. After all, shouldn't they know better than to get into a car with a stranger? If every sex work transaction is paid rape, as some feminists have stated, what does that mean when a sex worker is raped? Instead, we should see the violence that sex workers experience as part of a spectrum of violence against women more generally. Instead of excluding sex workers from discussions about violence against women, they should be deeply involved as they have much to contribute. After all, for centuries, they've had no one to rely on but themselves. Sex workers, especially more marginalized ones, continue to face incredibly high rates of situational and predatory violence. And for reasons every woman understands, when faced with a criminal justice system that fails them at every turn, very little of this violence is reported to police. But unlike many women experiencing violence, sex workers also feel like they cannot turn to their sisters at anti-violence organizations, as they fear that their experiences will be misconstrued and they will be judged for selling or trading sex. With a deeper understanding of sex work and sex workers, anti-violence organizations can begin to transcend the ideological debate and just focus on meeting sex workers' needs. This is not easy work, not by a long shot. Changing attitudes and challenging ideology about sex work requires every individual to look within themselves to uncover their beliefs and values that underpin their feelings about this topic. But it is worth it. Sex workers are extending their hands to you. Will you take them? This afternoon, my colleague Alison Clancy and I will be conducting a 3.5-hour workshop on making your services more accessible to sex workers, and I encourage you to attend. By recommitting to focusing on basic support skills such as active listening and a person-centered approach, as well as explicit sex work harm reduction messaging, anti-violence organizations can begin to provide much-needed services to this underserved population. Thank you very much for listening to me.